Super excited to be in this room. You're my favorite people. Um, there's conservation biologists, scientists, science writers, documentary filmmakers. Praveen, excellent film if you're here. Thank you so much for that. Um, so I'm super chuffed, and I've been bouncing around like an Easter bunny from one room to another. A little word of praise for the SCCS. I've attended an SCCS at Cambridge, but this is one of my favorite because you guys every year are constantly pushing the boundaries. I've sat in on sessions on ethical handling of amphibians. I've been listening to murmurs of data in social sciences and its relevance to the natural sciences. I've been listening to gender debates. So you're expanding the horizons of conservation biology every year, and that is so refreshing. Now, enough praise about you guys. Let me move on to my presentation. So, bedtime stories. If you belong to my generation, this must make you feel very nostalgic. We all read these stories, felt so good about the world, felt so good about our little world, the enchanted woods, the faraway tree. Here's the problem with the good stories. They make us feel very comfortable. We feel all sort of cozy and secure in the world that they created. Now, the problem really is what we're dealing with right now. And I'm hoping through this presentation to move you out of this realm of bedtime stories, because I feel that with social media, with Facebook, we're slowly going into this zone of the happy zone where yes, we want to tell stories, but how is it impacting our natural world? Are these stories in any ways influencing policy? And perhaps to inspire each one of you over here that the stories that you tell can impact policy, can save ecosystems and species and habitats. And how do we do that? Okay, purpose of conservation biology, we've all studied it in our textbooks. The father of conservation biology defines it as a crisis discipline. The aim is to halt extinction, preserve ecosystems, and maintain diversity at all levels from genetic to species levels. I'm going over this because I actually, I'm not testing your knowledge on how well you've read your textbooks, but more that each of these words are value-loaded terms, and I'm going to come back to this later. I started, again, I went off like all of you. I wanted to study conservation biology. I went off first to this part of Kenya where along the coast, the colobus monkey, they were building bridges for these animals because there was a coastal road cutting through their habitat. The animals, initially when the bridges were built, would not use those bridges. And I'm saying this in the context of all the linear projects which are coming up across India, and we're saying repeatedly, let's build underpasses, which cut through national parks and sanctuaries, and whether an analysis or study has been done about whether these animals will actually use these underpasses, I'm not too sure. In this case, the colobus monkey saw the vervets using the bridges, and then they started using the bridges as well. Went off to Jersey Zoo, pitched a tent outside the zoo. I couldn't afford anything else. It's an expensive island. And studied the black lion tamarin. So I actually did a behavioral comparison, a study where they had free-range black lion tamarins within the zoo. That's how Jersey Zoo is. And there was another family troop which was inside a cage. So I did a comparison to see whether there was any difference. And what we found was that the animals, even though they were free-ranging within the zoo, were actually trapped in a psychological cage. So I don't think the zoo authorities were very pleased with the results of my finding, because this was being used as a reintroduction protocol to release these animals back, hopefully in the wild. And to find out that they were still trapped in a psychological cage, of course, meant that they had to revisit their reintroduction protocols. All very well till this point, completed my master's thesis, came back to India, and here's what I found. I'd read about the Evil Quartet, Jared Diamond talks about it, you know it all, and what I found was what was happening in India was our economy was opening up. We suddenly had roads and dams and highways and mining projects slicing through some of our best habitats. And no one in the media was talking about it. Most of the stories I came across were of a poaching outbreak here, or an individual tiger which had died in some national park. But no one was talking about how our habitats were being lost to these big development projects. Little bit of politics over here. Forest diversion under the UPA government. I'm quoting these figures just to show that repeatedly, year after year, whether it's, doesn't matter which political party is there, but our figures as far as the MOEF, the Ministry of Environment and Forest is concerned, for forest diversion, they're constant in the sense that it never goes down, it only goes up. So the figures that you're looking at, on an average, 333 acres of forest diverted every day. I hate this term diversion, it sounds so harmless. They're being chopped, they're being decimated to make way, as I said, for our growth plans. This figure that you're seeing over here, this graph, this is, as I said, this is data which comes to the MOEF. It does not include state government level data because forest diversion also happens at the state government level for areas under 40 hectares. What I'm trying to say is that the numbers would actually be much higher. And this is data fresh out of the oven. This is 21st September. 2,400 hectares is the forest land diversion, which was in the last meeting, 21st of September. As you can see, the states like Andhra and Orissa, they are leading in terms of diversion. This is for mining, road projects. You're seeing Madhya Pradesh twice over there because one is for mining and another is, as I said, for road projects. This is just of one meeting, so don't get misled by the graph. This is just to show you the latest figures which I was able to take out and from another website called the ERC, who also collect this data every month to look at how forest diversion takes place. Some of you may be working in these areas. This is a map which shows, if you can see the dots here, what do you think the dots represent? Dams. So there's small, medium, big dams pockmarked across our rivers. And when I first saw this, there are protected areas which are being submerged. There are rivers, the confluence of rivers which will no longer be confluences. There are EIA reports which don't mention otters, which are actually found in that area. The EIA reports for these dams say, we'll do compensatory afforestation, which sounds wonderful, but you're not doing it in situ, you're doing it in Lalitpur in Uttar Pradesh. So what is the point of bringing back the forest if you don't do it in the area where you've actually destroyed the forest? So these are some of, I think, the problems which we don't address enough. The Northeast is slated to be the powerhouse of the country. I don't know if there are students here who work in the Northeast. You could overlay this with the biodiversity map. It's a biodiversity hotspot. Every little red dot that you see over here, again, is pockmarked, earmarked for a dam project. I've marked this in particular because one of the stories I did, and I'll talk about it towards the end of this presentation on what the threats are. Development project, the Konkan coast, if you've been there, this map doesn't show it very well. Beautiful, there are 11 eco-sensitive sites, again, which will be impacted by these development projects. There's thermal power plants, there's ports, there's a nuclear power project. Now, you may say, that's fine, it's along the Konkan coast, but every 20 kilometers. And when they apply for permissions for individual projects. The cumulative impacts on that particular area is never studied. When you look at thermal power plants, they discharge water back into the sea at much higher temperatures. So it affects the fish populations there, it affects the livelihoods of the fishermen who live over there, but again, this is never accounted for. What if we told stories that held these people responsible? This man who said that we should not call it forest diversion because after all we go and plant trees. So we should not call it forest diversion, we should call it afforestation projects. This man who loved to be in the news, who told us that he was stopping projects, but if you actually look at the data, you find that the rates of clearances were the same even during his time. This lady, again, the rates of clearances continue to be as high. I wrote a piece, talking about the number of projects that she had cleared. Years later, I discovered there was a file in the ministry which was prepared in my name on how she was planning to sue my media house for the stories that I'd done. So it's not always pleasant dealing with these people, but someone needs to ask the uncomfortable questions. Right. So now that I've created the setup of what's going on, you see it all around you, I literally stumbled into my first story. All wide-eyed, and I'm going to talk about habitat destruction and the evil quartet, as Jared Diamond had spoken about. I got a call from, just a biologist, just like all of you out here. He called me and he said, how soon can you reach Etawah? It's Gopi Sundar. And I said, well, it's 5 hours away, but I can try. And he said, well, what's happening is that there's an airport which is coming up on the habitat of this bird, the world's tallest flying bird, the Sarus crane. Wildlife Trust of India, many of the people are here. They were in fact working on a project at that time. They were documenting how this was a mosaic of wetlands and agricultural fields was in fact home to a sizable population of the Sarus crane. So we're not talking about 1 bird, 2 birds, 10 birds. This was 2/3 of the world's population of the Sarus crane was found in this area. And I'd like to show you here my first story.
The last dance of the Sarus crane. The world's tallest flying bird is in trouble. These wetlands of Etawah in Uttar Pradesh, home to nearly 1/3 of the world's population of the Sarus, may soon give way to this brand new airstrip. Chief Minister Mulayam Singh Yadav wants the state bird of UP, the Sarus crane, to make way for steel jets. We arrived a day before the Supreme Court committee was to visit Etawah to assess if the airport will damage the birds or their habitat in any way. This is what we found. Violation 1. Wetlands being filled with mud, in direct violation of the Allahabad High Court order of 2002. Violation 2. Nearly 15 local people were deployed at different spots around the airstrip to shoo away the Sarus cranes that have been nesting here. Others were even ready to swear that they had seen no Sarus cranes in this area.
कोई तालाब नहीं यहाँ है।
अच्छा।
शुरू से बिल्कुल प्लेन जमीन है।
अच्छा।
खेती होती थी, मतलब
हाँ।
यहाँ पर किसी कोई आपत्ति ना कोई पक्षी रहता है यहाँ पर किसी प्रकार का।
तो ये यहाँ पे कोई चिड़िया भी मिलता है क्या? हाँ?
कोई चिड़िया नहीं चिड़िया कोई चिड़िया
कोई चिड़िया नहीं है। But one local person did tell us the truth.
जे सपा वाले कार्यकर्ता कहें कि मतलब जब डीएम साहब सब रोक गए इन पे क्या इन मत बताना कि चिड़िया कोई आती है और सब उड़वा देना.
According to the Chief Wildlife Warden of UP, in the submission given to the Supreme Court, there are no Sarus cranes to be found nearly within 2 kilometers of the airport. As you can see behind us, there is the airport, and you can also see within 200 meters is a pair of Sarus cranes.
2 किलोमीटर का लगभग वेटलैंड है जो कि सीपेज एरिया के कारण बन गया था। मार्शलैंड था अच्छा खासा ये, तो वो पूरा का पूरा चला गया और उसकी वजह से ये इनका नेस्टिंग प्लेस और उनका फीडिंग ग्राउंड्स, रूस्टिंग ग्राउंड सारा कुछ समाप्त हो गया।
A number of documents available with CNN IBN's special investigation team shows how the airport will damage the birds and the wetlands. For instance, this map clearly shows an overlap of the Sarus breeding grounds and the site of the airstrip construction. Next day, on the day of the arrival of the Supreme Court committee, the Chief Minister, by a strange coincidence, is also in Etawah. When we asked the CM on the need to build an airport in rural Uttar Pradesh, this is what he had to say.
एयरपोर्ट नहीं है, ये जो हमारा हवाई पट्टी बनी है इसको थोड़ा बढ़ा रहे हैं, जिससे आधुनिक कुछ छोटे छोटे जो जहाज उतरते हैं कुछ अच्छे भी जहाज आ गए हैं जिससे वो भी उतर सके। बस
हमने कल डॉक्यूमेंट किया है, वहाँ गांव वाले बिठाए गए हैं कि सुप्रीम कोर्ट की कमेटी आ रही है, वो उनको भगा रहे हैं वहाँ से।
ज़्यादा निराधार असत्य कोई नहीं हो। किसकी भेजी हुई आई हो?
सर CNN IBN।
नहीं और कोई ऊपर से कोई और आपकी गलती नहीं है,
नहीं सर, ये चैनल
आपकी गलती, चैनल की गलती
नहीं
है,
सर, आप
आपकी गलती नहीं
सर, आप
है।
हमें
जो
बताइए
सवाल कर रहे हैं
जी।
सब नेगेटिव।
Twice CNN IBN special investigation team was obstructed by the local administration in Etawah. आप हमसे ऐसे बात कर रहे हैं जैसे
Now
कोई
you
चोर
are
घुसा
free.
है।
Now you are free. You
No,
can
no.
go.
For the Chief Minister Mulayam Singh Yadav, an airstrip in his constituency is of greater value than the state bird of UP. Will these gracious birds have to make way for the Chief Minister's flight of fancy and crash land onto this muddy graveyard? We hope not. From Etawah, with cameraman Umesh, this is Bahar Dutt.
Right. Thank you. I had no idea Mulayam Singh Yadav was dangerous until my editor called me and said, please get out of there if all this is happening. As I said, I just accidentally walked into this story. We went back to the office, sat overnight. We broadcast the story for the next 2 days. I was told wildlife stories don't run in primetime news. We headlined the story for the next 48 hours. The opposition took up the issue. Suddenly we were told that Mulayam Singh Yadav has allocated 10 crore rupees for the protection of the state bird of Uttar Pradesh. The airport did come through because the construction happened, but we were able to stop the expansion. And when I say we, there were a number of NGOs involved, so I can't take the credit for that. But the fact is that we were able to highlight what this man was doing and bring in the concept of the habitat of a species which needs protection. I want to show you another story, and the reason why I've chosen this story is because it was happening in far out Meghalaya, and it was assumed that no one would ever go there. And I'm lucky that at that stage at least, my editor would send me out to these far off places and say, I was able to go there with the document. There was a document which said that the area where this cement factory was coming up is a rocky, barren wasteland. And I was able to go there and take shots with my camera person of the forest there and show visually to an audience sitting in Delhi, which may never end up in Meghalaya, that this is what the papers are saying and this is what the reality is. Please excuse how I'm dressed. It's not a forest dress in this because I was pretending to be a tourist who had lost her way from Cherrapunji and ended up in Shela Valley. The factory was on the other side of a river, so I was just pretending to be like this lost bird.
Cherrapunji, Meghalaya. Once famous as the wettest place on planet Earth, in its valley lie giant waterfalls and vast contiguous stretches of India's best forests. It's not easy reaching this remote corner. We go by boat
उधर जाना हमको उस तरफ
and then hitch a ride in a truck.
ले चलें
Deep in the forest, cement giant Lafarge has set up a plant worth $225 million to extract limestone, which will be sent by this giant conveyor belt to this factory on the border with Bangladesh. An agreement between India and Bangladesh, backed and funded by the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, led to the setting up of the Chatak factory in Bangladesh. The raw material is to be supplied from India. All this is happening at the cost of massive violations of the Forest Conservation Act and strict orders of the Supreme Court. This report that I have in my hand clearly states that permissions were given to this mine because it is located in an area which is a wasteland with sporadic growth of trees and shrubs. As you can see behind me, the mine is located in an area which has thick virgin forests. But Lafarge obtained the permission to mine in these forests because of this Environment Impact Assessment report prepared by a Delhi-based company, ERM or Environment Resource Management Private Limited. But a CNN-IBN special investigation found many violations of the country's environment laws and directives of the Supreme Court on the ground here. Lafarge constructed this 17-kilometer long conveyor belt through dense forest land, and the EIA report does not mention this. The EIA also describes the forest land as agricultural land, and further goes on to describe the 100-acre site as rocky, barren and a wasteland. Clearly, Lafarge cement factory is violating a bunch of environmental laws, a fact confirmed by this officer.
Anybody who doesn't know even the technicality of the forest, that what should be called forest, will simply say that this is a forest. Yeah, please.
After repeated requests for the company's position, this special investigation received a written reply. The land was not forest land as advised to us by experts. We maintain high standards of sustainable development and are prepared to abide by the Forest Conservation Act. But the Ministry of Environment and Forests is not convinced. This letter dated April 2007, available exclusively with CNN-IBN, is a notice directing Lafarge to shut down its operations. Another, by the Deputy Conservator of Forests, asks why the company ERM should not be blacklisted. How was a mining company allowed to operate in India's best tropical forest? Was there an assumption that no one would notice the violations in this remote corner between India and Bangladesh? One thing is for certain, if the rampant destruction of Meghalaya's forest continues, global warming will soon be an immediate reality, and Meghalaya will no longer be the wettest place on planet Earth. With camera person Mukut Mehdi from the Indo-Bangladesh border, Bahar Dutt.
World Bank project. This was a cement giant. Again, in 2010, orders were issued for this mining to stop. But I have to say, these are the twists and turns which a story takes. In 2011, the Supreme Court lifted the ban. But at least what we were able to do through this story and through, again, a concerted media campaign and the fact that there was an honest forest officer involved in this who was repeatedly writing those letters, the Supreme Court told the ministry that the people who do the EIAs, there needs to be a clear listing of them. Why should ERM not be blacklisted? All this came into the public domain. I was suddenly in my office told that an international team from Lafarge wanted to meet me, and in fairness, I had to meet them because they wanted to present their side of the story, and a team flew down from Europe, and I was told that they could take me to South Africa to show me how responsibly they practice their mining as a reward for doing this story. The next story I'm going to show to you is a story which this is called Saving the Ganga. We spent 6 months following the river Ganga from source to sea. It's a story which, it's a documentary which got many high TRPs, and the channel was very happy with it. But for me, the challenge was how to get in the hard-hitting facts, how to move away from those bedtime stories which I was talking about initially, and how to get in the real, the real problems which were facing the river. And so that's what we did. We spoke about, the fun aspects of the Ganga, whether it was river rafting or the religious aspects, but also what was happening to the ecology of the river. So I'll just play this.
The animal waste laced with deadly chemicals from the tanneries and glue factories is further segregated by smaller contractors right here on the river bank. They take what they can, resell as crude manure, even soap. The toxic waste left behind finds its way into the soil and then into the Ganga.
क्या बनाते हैं इसका?
खाद बनती है इसकी। इसमें पानी का कोई इसमें टीचिंग नहीं ना गंगा से। वो आपके सामने देख लीजिए।
नहीं, लेकिन यहाँ से कई बार हटाया गया है, पुलिस वाले भी।
हाँ, पुलिस वाले वो जो गंदगी वाला वो उधर है, वो देखिए। ये सब हम लोगों का एकदम सूखा काम है।
It's an unregulated business. Officers from the Pollution Control Board rarely seen here.
कितने लोग काम करते हैं?
As I talk to the workers, I find the main contractor has his own child working on the waste here with his bare hands.
तो ये बच्चे भी काम कर रहे हैं यहाँ पर?
कौन?
ये इधर आइए, इधर आइए। ये तो बच्चे हैं ये जो काम कर रहे हैं।
ये हमारे लड़के हैं।
अच्छा।
माल छांट रहे हैं, हटा रहे हैं, ऐसा ना हो
बच्चों का
लेबर।
तो काम करना मना है ना?
अब लेबर हमारी अच्छा माल ले जाएगी लाद के। अभी अपना काम है।
इधर आओ सामने।
हेलो।
इधर आ जाओ, इधर आ जाओ। आपका क्या उम्र है?
हैं?
12-13 साल है। हाथ दिखाओ।
मैडम ये ऐसा नहीं ना कि 24 घंटे हाथ में रहे। लेबर काम कर रही है। अब ये देखते रहते, ये लड़के देख रहे हैं कि कोई गलत माल तो नहीं चला जा रहा है।
आपके पिताजी कहाँ हैं? ये?
So, as I said, there were tough stories to tell. Why judge these people? It's a poor part of the city. But there was a range of issues which was affecting the Ganga. The Kanpur tanneries is one. I've spoken about the fact that there were dams being built in the upper reaches. And finally, I want to show you, this is the last clip I'm going to show you. I know that everyone wants to move on to the prize distribution and there's other stuff happening. So I'm going to make this quick. Some stories, it's not all hunky-dory. Some stories can get you into trouble. And I must admit that before what happened in this story. I was a little bit naive because I thought that if you're a journalist, the system comes forward to protect you. And of course, in recent times, that sounds even more naive given all that has happened, whether in Bangalore city, but that aside, that's a subject for another discussion. But this was, I had gone to Goa to basically look at the illegal mining which was happening there. And we drove to Molem Wildlife Sanctuary, where we were told that there were mines just on the outskirts of the sanctuary, and these were operating in violation of the Supreme Court orders. At that time, the Supreme Court had said that no mining is to take place. And we were able to climb up a hill and actually document that there were trucks coming in, they were removing all the ore. We got all that on camera, came down the hill, and started driving towards Panjim. Somehow in my head, I had sensed that there would be trouble. And I swear, before this, I've never done this. I've never called up anyone important to say, I'm going for a story, please help. But this is the first time I actually called up the Chief Secretary of Goa and said, I'm going to this area, there's going to be trouble. Please, can you tell me who to speak to in the police? And maybe my instinct was right, because what unfolded was that as we came down the hill, a big truck comes and stops us. And there's the sanctuary on one side, there's the mining area on the other, and there's a road, and there's a truck. So there's really nowhere I could have gone except perhaps run into the forest, but there was a wall there, so even that wasn't possible. So this guy came, and he just came and blocked our way. And when I'm nervous, I start shouting. So that's all I could do at that time, and that's what I did, and you'll see what ensues then.
It's obvious that the owners of the mine are nervous about our filming. A huge mining truck deliberately blocks the road to prevent us from going further.
Tell us, do you have permission to operate on forest land? Do you have permission? Do you have permission to operate?
No, I have no permission.
And then we are surrounded by 14 to 15 workers from the mine attempting to snatch our camera. This man, Mr. Vedya, the manager of Hede Mines, lunges for our camera. Based on the visual evidence by CNN IBN and an urgent writ petition by Goa Foundation, the Central Impart Committee of the Supreme Court has ordered an inquiry asking why the mine should not be shut down.
So what happened really in that short clip that you saw was the police came, and I thought, oh, they've come to rescue me. And before we knew it, they asked us to get into the car, and we were taken to the nearby Thana. And they said, we're going to put slap charges of trespassing on you and deal with it. And so I called up my editor, and my editor said, look, you're far away from Panjim, and you're far away from the city. I don't know where you are. At the moment, all I care about is that the crew and you should come back safely to Delhi. So drop the story, drop what you're doing, just come back, because we need you to be safe. And I argued with him, and I said, no, I'm not going to do that. I've worked hard on this story. I'm not giving up my story. So this argument ensued, and I asked the team, what do you want to do? I had a producer with me and a camera person. What you don't see in that clip is after the scuffle happens, they actually had a car which comes out at full speed, and I grabbed my camera person and just shoved him to the ground, because if I hadn't done that, that car would have just run over him. So these people were serious. I mean, they basically wanted our footage. And I was struggling. So this went on for a couple of hours. We sat at the police station. Their lawyer came. We didn't have a lawyer because we were just far away from anywhere. And they were well prepared. And so I called up a crime reporter. And I said, what do I do? He said, leave the tapes. Do you understand? Leave the tapes. So I said, okay, I'll leave the tapes. And so what I did was, I left blank tapes with them, which they thought was the visuals. I came back to Delhi, again argued with my editor, and we ran the story, but that's not all that I did. I took the footage. At that time, the Central Impart Committee of the Supreme Court was active. I went to them, I showed them the footage, and the case went on, and the show cause notice was issued. So we didn't just stop at the story, we actually took it to court.
It's obvious that the owners...
So I'm sure this is crossing your mind. Should conservation biologists be practicing advocacy? Now, scientists want to be objective. But is that the same necessarily as not caring? And I'm just throwing these questions out. Maybe in the next SCCS, you may want to take these up as possible subjects of discussion. Does advocacy mean we care how things turn out? And I started, remember, with the definition of conservation biology as a crisis discipline. And I do believe that conservation science is not value-free. We want a world which has biodiversity. We look down upon concepts like deforestation. And I do believe that we as conservation scientists, or I would say environment journalists, in fact, practice advocacy. So that's my take on it. And this is my favorite, I always do this. Every government in the world right now is trying to tell us that the Kuznets curve or growth without limits is going to get us out of the current ecological crisis that we are facing. Basically, what this Kuznets curve says is that we're going through environmental degradation because we're developing right now. And at some point when we're all rich, then we'll have the money to save our tigers, clean up our rivers, and deal with carbon emissions and pollution. But I think climate change has proven that this doesn't work. The Kuznets curve no longer works. A, because biodiversity once lost, cannot be brought back. And B, because the developed world actually outsource their pollution, the polluting industries, to the developing world. And that's how they were able to escape this. So I don't believe in the Kuznets curve, and I feel that as biologists, maybe we should dabble in a little bit of economics as well sometimes to challenge these economic theories which are thrown at us all the time. Some tips just before we finish for the day on how to tell a story. As I said, let's move away from, it's all very well to tell the beautiful stories and get those wonderful likes on Instagram and Facebook. But how is your story impacting the natural world? How is it impacting policy? In my stories, have always used that as a guiding factor. As I said, we link it up with the courts. We don't always stop at just the story. You don't need to do that, but perhaps if you're in an area, you've collected some data, you could get in touch with a lawyer who could file the case for you. Find journalists who tell the difficult stories. And I'm saying this because I'm not the only one, here telling the difficult stories. This is Siddharth Pandey from NDTV. He used, those night vision cameras which Praveen used in his film. He actually went to some of the mining sites in Haryana and showed how illegal mining was happening at night and in the Aravalis. And so he's telling the difficult stories. There's Jay Mazumdar, who first broke the story of the tigers going from Sariska. Your very own Aarti Kumar Rao, who's from Bangalore City. She went to the Sundarbans in Bangladesh when the oil spill happened, and her story was picked up across the world. Here are a bunch of people telling the difficult stories. As I said, stories that impact policy. I want to leave you just with a couple of them. This is Dibang, which is going to be Asia's tallest dam, which is going to come up in Arunachal Pradesh. And I had the good fortune, I would say, to be there at a time when the Prime Minister at that time was supposed to come to Dibang to lay the foundation stone for a dam which did not have environment clearance. This was the Prime Minister of the country was violating the top environment law of the country. So it didn't set a very good example. I know that they didn't have the environment clearance because I was there when the public hearing was to be held. And the only slogan which people held over there was NHPC go back. So the public hearing didn't take place. So I filed my story from there, and the Prime Minister got so scared of the negative media coverage that he was getting that finally he didn't make it to Dibang. He only came till Itanagar, I was told. So I'm not saying that every time we do a story we're able to stop a dam, but at least we're playing our role as a watchdog in the media. This is this is the Yamuna floodplains. I'm giving this example because in the media there was a lot of talk about Shri Ravi Shankar and what he was doing to the floodplains. But long before he set up this the Art of Living event, actually there was a man who came in 2008 and said he wants to set up a shopping festival on the Yamuna river banks on the lines of the Dubai Shopping Festival. So he actually managed to do that, and we did a story on it. Incidentally, we were able to do a story also because It's very close to the channel office, and I used to pass there every day and feel extremely angry looking at this Dubai shopping festival coming up on the riverbed. It's something which we were able to stop because this man had plans to have the Dubai shopping festival on the banks of the Yamuna for the next 10 years. So this is how you set precedents in the media as well. So next time around when Shri Ravi Shankar came, yes, his event did happen, but at least we were able to raise our voice in the media. Sanjeev Chaturvedi, I don't know if you people know about him, but he actually physically stopped a bulldozer from getting into a wildlife sanctuary because they didn't have permissions from the National Board of Wildlife. This was for the Chief Minister of Haryana's pet project. He wanted to build an irrigation canal which went right through the wildlife sanctuary, and he physically stopped, he's a forest officer, who physically stopped that bulldozer and said, I'm not going to allow this. For that, this man has been transferred 22 times. But many of us in the media have, written about his story. He's still never been reinstated back to his original cadre. So these are ongoing battles. But as I said, to finish here, tell the difficult stories. You may just end up saving a species or a habitat. Thank you all so much.